What is up, everybody? Welcome to Comic Book Club. I'm Alex.
I'm Justin.
And we got a special guest for you on our bonus podcast today, Joshua Williamson. Josh, welcome. Hello. Always great to see you. Welcome back. And we are going to be talking about everything G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe #1 is coming out in November 13th. If I have my dates correctly, you got to get your orders in at the old comic book shop. Get them in. Very exciting. But I wanted to start off with a broad
question. Actually, before you jump into the broad question, I just got to say, are you a graduate of the Cobra Corps? You seem to be wearing a...
Yeah.
Is that a university, a college, adult education?
I went to the training camp. Training camp. They put you through a bunch of intense training to see if you'll be able to join Cobra or not. So
how'd you do? Can we ask? How did it end up?
I mean, I'm not sure if I should answer that or not. It might be a reveal for something later, but maybe.
Ooh, drawing yourself into the issue.
I've always been a Cobra person. I've always been
a Cobra.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we talked about one of the issues, I think, in the back, where it was like, when I was a kid, we would, my buddy and I, we were both like, we're so hardcore in G.I. Joe, and we would make these like deals every year for birthdays and Christmases, where it was like, okay, here's the thing, like, I'm going to ask for this, you ask for this, that way we wouldn't get doubles.
Oh, genius.
The easiest thing to do was like, okay, I'm going to get vehicles and Cobra. You will get bases and G.I. Joes. So he always had like the pit, he ended up having a lot of the different bases and stuff. I had the Terror Drone, but I would go through and be like, I had so many Cobra toys. So many Cobra toys. And I think Cobra Commander is like one of my favorite characters. He's probably my favorite character in the whole thing. And all of G.I. Joe, but
were your parents like, is our son evil?
No, I don't think they like it is. No. I've always gravitated towards villains though. Like I've always liked villain characters. I always like it's funny. Like if you read my books, you'll notice I always have a jerk character. Right. So it's like at DC, it was always like, we probably talked before, right? It was like, I love Barry. Barry is great, but I need someone to bounce off of. And it was like, okay, here's Godspeed because he's a jerk. This will be easy, right? So Superman, how am I going to write Superman? Oh, Lex Luthor's here. He's a jerk.
He's there. He's there. Really around.
Yeah, he's sort of it's interesting. I like those kinds of characters that are a little bit on the edge, So it's like, with this, it was like, okay, Duke is very much not on the edge, even though we kind of wrote him that way originally, like to tweak it and to show why he's cool. But it was like, oh, here's Cobra Commander, and he's a psychopath. So it's like, all right, I got that guy here. But I was like characters that can bounce off each other. That's really what it comes down to. But no, my parents did not think I was like an evil person.
Well, I mean, that's a good segue then to talk about the makeup of the G.I. Joe team. And I'm curious to hear which is the jerk character of this. So you've got Duke, Stalker, Rock and Roll, CoverGirl, Clutch, and Baroness. I assume Baroness is the jerk character.
Major jerk tendencies.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
But there's also Clutch. Like I always like Clutch playing that role too. Like Clutch is, it's. I just like watching these characters that can bounce off each other. And if they're going to bounce off each other, it means they can't really get along, right? There has to be a little bit of tension. It can't just be nonstop high fives and kumbaya. Like you need to have that bit of conflict among each other. And so, Baroness definitely plays a little bit of an antagonistic part. Clutch isn't antagonistic at all, but he just likes to say shit. But, it's like, and he's so different from Duke, right? And that's really what so much of this is about, which is making sure these characters felt different from each other. That's one of the powers of G.I. Joe in general. Are you guys G.I. Joe guys?
Can we be honest? Not really. Pete, our third co-host, 100% is.
He's the big Joe. I actually wasn't allowed. My parents were like, my mom was like, too many guns. And so like, I would always like the illicit show to watch when I was a kid. So I would only see it at friends' houses.
Yeah, no, I come from a military family, so I think this was like, like my grandpa was in World War II. My other side of grandparents were in the Korean War, and then it was like my dad who was in the Air Force and in the NSA. Like he's done a lot of military stuff, so it was like we were such a military house. It was like, oh, here's this cartoon. Yes, we can watch. You can watch this. But I was also watching He-Man and Transformers too. But I think there was something about this one that I just really gravitated towards more so than the rest of them. But that's interesting. I'm always curious about this because it's like one of the challenges of working on this property was making sure that it like appealed to the hardcore fandom, but also was accessible for people. So that was something we really spent a lot of time on, making that math work.
Well, how do you, I mean, just to get into that, how do you make that math work? Like, what is the balance there, and how much is going into an issue, and like throwing in a little Easter egg, throwing in a reference, and then thinking, that.
Well, that's definitely part. I'm not
going
gonna lie. Like, Easter eggs is always part of that math. I mean, you see it all the time. I watch Agatha, and there was a part of me watching Agatha being like, oh, this show could be super accessible. Like, you don't have to have known anything else about Marvel, I think, to watch this show. But I was like, oh my God, there's so many Easter eggs in this that I was like, is it? It's an interesting thing. But that's just what Marvel and like these big properties do, is they're like, here's this new thing, and then all these Easter eggs.
Yeah, like how they're all Mephisto at the end.
Yeah, they're all Mephisto. I haven't watched this new episode this week. I'm not sure if they're all Mephisto. Dude, I love Mephisto. I love Mephisto as a character. So I have been, dude, I was crazy on Scarlet Witch. There was a part in Scarlet Witch where I was like, you see that fly flying around?
Yeah, sick.
Right? We were like in WandaVision. I'm like, that fly is the devil. That fly is Mephisto. Like when they were in the basement. Anyway, we could talk about this.
Well, but no, to get back to G.I. Joe, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid that brain poisoning where you're I'm going crazy here?
You just have to find I've talked about this a lot with this property, and I think about this a lot about comics in general. And sometimes I feel like it's missing in places. At the end of the day, it's about a human story, and that's where you relate, right? So it's like, I'll use this as an example. Or there's a couple examples I can use, really. There's a reason why high school TV shows are so popular. Do you know why? Do you know why high school shows are so popular?
I mean, my theory about high school shows being so popular is that's the time of biggest emotions when everything is new.
But it's also the last thing we all have in common. Like, once we get out of high school, all of our lives go.
Yeah.
Right? They all start going in all these different directions, right? Like, a lot of times.
Not me and Justin. We've been podcasting since elementary school. We quit immediately.
It certainly feels that way. And we're a podcast where all three of us are jerks. So I feel like we're like a Josh Williamson.
Right. Yeah, I could write your guys' show. It would be a blast.
Oh, yikes.
But, you look at something like The Godfather, and The Godfather opens on a wedding. And it's like, here's this wedding, something very relatable. And it's all of these amazing character pieces and these little small things that you don't realize are all of these character introductions, right? Like, you were learning so much about every character, and not just when Michael sits down and basically tells you who each character is, but there's so much you learn about, like, Sonny and during the wedding, right? Like, you learn so much about him in that wedding, and each character is like that. But the reason is, like, The Godfather is this really, really big story, but it opens small. Mm-hmm. It opens a wedding. And I think about this all the time of, like, there's a phrase in writing where it's like, the bigger the world, the smaller the story, right?
Right.
And it can go both ways, like vice versa. But I always think about that. And that's something with this. I mean, you look at even like what Robert was doing when he started Invincible off, and how it's like so much of that first issue is like them eating dinner together, him taking the trash to work. It's like these smaller human things. And that's why when I look at all of these properties, these big fandoms, all of it, it's like, you can take that massive, massive world and that massive mythology, but you got to tell a human story in it. You got to tell something smaller and is about those characters within that world, right? I always look at, like, some of my favorite stuff is just when you have a character that's really well established, you know what they want, you know what they're about, and you just throw them in a new situation and throw them in new worlds, right? And it almost doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what those worlds are, but it's the character bits, right, of the story, right? What does the character want? Bringing it back to Agatha for just a moment, one of my favorite parts in Agatha is at the end of the second episode where Agatha turns around and tells every character what they want.
Yeah.
And it's such a, like, exposition thing, but it's like, this is genius because they're telling you so much in these moments. And so that's the stuff with this where it's like, when you're working on these properties, these big, massive mythology stories, this is kind of like, okay, let's bring it back down. That's why with both Duke and Cobra Commander, when I was writing those books, it was like with Duke, it was very much about like a crisis of faith, like a moment where no one believes you and you're questioning yourself. I think people can relate to that. So it's like, you're at a moment where you're falling versus coming up. And I was like, that's a more human story. Like, it almost doesn't matter if it's giant robots and big explosions. It's like, no, this is a person who's looking for something. They have lost their way. And that is a much more human story. And that's where with Duke, it was like, yeah, there's giant robots, all this stuff, but this is what this is about. And same with Cobra Commander, where it's like, it's almost like he's trying to prove himself, right? One of the things with Duke Cobra Commander is I had them on separate journeys, but they were the same, where it was like, Duke is questioning everything at the beginning, and he's like questioning what he believes, right? And he's like, I forget the government, I'm out of here. But at the ending, he kind of reaffirms and comes back around and realizes what's important to him. Whereas in Cobra Commander is like very loyal to Cobra Law, but is manipulating things and is going through a different version of like a crisis of faith. And then by the ending, he like rejects it. You know, they betray him.
They're sort of on opposite tracks.
Yeah,
in that way.
To see these things collide. And so that's really the trick, dude. Like when you're working on this stuff, is how do you just tell like human stuff, right? And give little relatable human things.
Just a question about Duke. As someone who hasn't grown up with G.I. Joe, it does feel like though that first issue and first arc and his crisis, is that why he's so reckless now? Because this is light about what's in this G.I. Joe book, but like he's commented on by other people several times, like, yo, this guy's crazy.
Yeah, he's a little broken. He's still a little broken, you know. He was always a man of action. So it's interesting, like there's certain phrases for both characters that I sort of latched onto, right? So it's like Cobra Commander, like something he would yell a lot in the cartoon was retreat. He would always yell retreat. So we were like, okay, this is a rule early on. This is a Cobra Commander doesn't retreat. He doesn't retreat. So what does that mean for him? So that creates he has to be much more conniving, manipulative, you know, to get out of situations. Like he's running into them. With Duke, it was like, oh, this is a man of action. And I was like, okay, well, this version of him is going to literally be that, which means he's a little impulsive, right? He's a little impulsive. He's a little bit like, I'm not going down. You are not taking me down regardless. I'm going to continue moving forward no matter what. Like I'm constantly in action. And that was sort of what was the thing with him, was taking him and being like, he's still a little broken. So he is definitely impulsive, you know. He's a little bit like, no, I don't care, I'm doing this to win. And
I think I can do this.
Yeah, it's a little different with him, you know. So yeah, that's why we make him different from what you've seen before, to make him a little bit more of a bite. I mean, that's the thing that's interesting about this, where it's like, we're not trying to retell what's happened before in any way. We're just taking all the pieces, we're taking the core of it. But this world is different because of how it was created, like because of the stuff with the Energon Universe, that the fact that Transformers are such a major piece of it. How does that change the dynamic of how G.I. Joe and Cobra are created? And then it changes how they react to things. And so that's where there's like everything has a little bit of a different bite to it than it did in the previous incarnations.
Well, this ties together a couple of the things you're talking about. Obviously, you've got the G.I. Joe side. The book is called G.I. Joe, but it sounds like you're gravitating towards Cobra. Are we going to see some more of that human side and development of Cobra in the G.I. Joe book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're going to see a bit more. I like writing the character piece stuff, right? I like writing the smaller moments, or the moments where characters, you get to kind of, I don't know, find what their rosebud is, for lack of a better phrase. Like, I love that stuff.
We all have one.
Like, yeah, exactly. I love that
stuff.
Love
mine's a sled, by the way.
Of course.
Yeah, just mention
original, yeah.
Mine's the Green Arrow toy, so that explains a lot. But, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Why don't we talk about another character who's on the G.I. Joe team, though? This is a new Joe called Risk.
Oh, yeah.
Skirting spoilers, shows up maybe in the first issue, maybe not, I guess.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
But,
nice.
But what can you tell them about him? Because this is a totally original character for the series.
Yeah. We knew we wanted to bring in a new character. And it was one of the more exciting bits. And, you know, we were talking about this a lot early on. And again, I don't want to make it like the new character show where there's a lot of new characters. So I was like, let's bring in a few. And with this one, I have a lot of G.I. Joe toys in my office. Like I have a bunch over here, like the big vehicles over here. I have a bunch on the ground. And then I have like a huge shelf over here of just G.I. Joe toys. Mm-hmm. And so every once in a while I'm writing, I just kind of stand up and I stare at them. I just go look at them. And and when I was looking at this, I was looking at the visuals of them. And I was like, you know, it's always interesting how the Joe's characters are always so unique and different looking. And when you're trying to create a G.I. Joe character, that's what you want to do. You want to be like, how do they look different from the rest of G.I. Joes? How do they stand out? Like, and if someone's going to make a toy of this, you know, fingers crossed, like if they are going to do that, how would it stand on this shelf, all these toys? How would he stand out? And I was talking to Ben Abernathy, who's the editor on G.I. Joe now and all the Energon Universe stuff. We were just like going back and forth. And I was like, you know what I've never seen before? I've never seen a character that wears a suit. Like the Crimson Twins would wear suits occasionally in their book, and so would Destro. But I've never seen a G.I. Joe that wore a suit. And I'm like, they would have all kinds of stuff. You know, like Chuckles wears a Hawaiian T-shirt, you know? So I'm like, there was a character who would wear a basketball jersey, so I'm like, can I potentially create somebody who wears a suit, and looking at things like that, like kind of John Wick trope,
right.
thing, and being like, how would he look differently in this? And that was how it kind of started. And then it was like, oh, okay, well, G.I. Joes always have like two things that they do, right? It's always like, they're not just a military person. They always have like some other thing, right? Like other gimmick or whatever. It is very like wrestling, where everyone has like a gimmick, basically. I'm a wrestler, but I'm also, an accountant, right?
She was going to say accountant. It's like, oh, yeah, cool. Like, how do you find the time?
Yeah. And then apparently he does people's taxes, and then he goes and beats them up at night. But it was like, which is we all feel anyway when it comes to taxes. But so it was, trying to figure out these little dynamics. And I'm like, oh, he's CIA. He does undercover missions. He does a lot of stuff overseas, but he's also this like hand-to-hand fighter guy, right? Because everyone has like a gimmick. And then we were like, oh, he also comes from money. Because it was always this thing about like, how is he different from everybody else? And then how is he going to react to this mix? Like, how is Duke going to react to him? And I started writing him as like, oh, well, Duke is like the Cyclops to his Wolverine, was sort of how I saw their dynamic. Mm-hmm. And being like, oh, okay, he's like a little bit of a grenade in the team dynamic because he's also a bit of a jerk character. So yeah, it was a lot of these little different pieces that kind of started building out who he was. And then I gave all that information to Tom, and I was like, go for it. And he came up with all these amazing designs. I mean, basically the design that we have is the design that he did, but it was always like, you think about toys, because it was kind of like, oh, let's say he has like this kind of belt buckle or this kind of vest or this kind of jacket. And it was like, oh, he has a shotgun and it's gold plated and we call it his moneymaker and like all this stuff. And it was just like little things like that to sort of start building out who he is, and like, and that's it right there. Like, who has a gun that's gold plated and called the moneymaker? Like, that tells you about his character. So it was stuff like that. We just kept building him out. But we're really excited about him. He'll be in the first issue, and then he'll play an important role in the book. But we're also not trying to make it like all about him. It's very much like he's another character in the book, and we will build out the stuff with him and try to actually organically integrate him in versus trying to like shove him into the
He's
book.
not the Poochie, basically, is what you're saying.
Yes, wow. That's a great example. Yeah, well, because when that stuff happens, people introduce a character, suddenly everything becomes about that new character, and I was like, no, like, he is a character. We were talking about we're gonna do like standalone issues in the book, not standalone, but like A-plot standalone stuff, And I was like, oh, we'll have the first time we ever have like a story about just him, it'll be like issue in the 30s. Like, that's how far we plan stuff too. So it's like, I don't want it to be all about him. It was, because it's really about the Joes as a team and Cobra. But yeah.
Go ahead.
One thing to just re-say here is that Duke is Cyclops. So you hear that, Pete? Just hold on to that, Pete LePage, that Duke is Cyclops. But second, like, I love the idea that every character has sort of two things, and it reminds me of other things outside of G.I. Joe, like the A-Team, or I used to read these like novels for men kind of a thing, where it's like a crack team goes and does a military operation. And it always was, and I love the way this book opens with that kind of like hit on everybody, and we get enough information to be just propelled into the action.
Well, that's what we were to do. Yeah.
Do you feel like, and all those like A-Team, all those things, it was about sort of reloading the mechanism. So is this book going to be that kind of like Joe's on missions? Is there going to be a super narrative over all of it? Or is it going to be more like mission accomplished? What's the next mission?
Oh, no, it's all one big story. Like, there's a lot of A-plot, we'll have A-plot stuff, but, where it's like, here's this mission, but there's a lot of B, C, D plot that will carry across for years to go. I mean, one of the things that always bugged me as a kid, and when I started working on this, and I started rewatching the cartoon again. I've watched the cartoon many, many times, but every time I would do it, I would sit there and I would look at like, it always bugged me. The first two minis are just G.I. Joe versus Cobra. Mm-hmm. And it was like, well, when do you actually beat them then? Right? Because if they're constantly like, it's just them again. And I was like, I wish there had been a bit more dynamic of like, G.I. Joe has multiple enemies. And like, I think the interaction of the Dreadnoks originally, I wish they had just been like, oh, these are mercenaries also working with Cobra Commander, right? I wish they'd been something separate. Same with the Shargagi clan, like all of this stuff, like, that's the stuff where that's why Scarlett sets up things up the way it does. and you get to see those things kind of come together and consolidate. So even like Major Bummer was in Duke, but he was a mercenary working for Destro, but he is not Cobra, So it was like about building this stuff out. And so, yeah, with the book, it's like we have this massive story that we're telling, and we're going to have these kind of like rhythmic plots, and eventually those C plots become the A plots, like that's always like the beautiful thing about long-term storytelling that I really enjoy doing. I like stuff where it's like, Robert does this really well, especially in Invincible, where you might have something that's like one page in one issue, and then 50 issues later, that one page is now the whole freaking thing. It's like, do you know what I mean? Like, I love stuff like that. I love it where it's like you feel like these things are earned, and that's stuff we're going to be doing here. So it's like these first 6 issues are really the first time that the G.I. Joe and Cobras are encountering each other. But it's just the beginning of a massive thing. And it's not always going to be Joe versus Cobra, because I didn't want it to always be that. I want it to be, even though they'll both always be a presence in the book, it won't always be about that conflict.
I wanted to ask you about the look of the book. You mentioned Tom Reilly's art. The pencils are fantastic, but I wanted to give a specific shout out to Jordi Belair's colors, which are phenomenal throughout. It gives it such a without specifically being newsprint, there's almost a newsprint.
Isn't that weird?
Comic.
It is. It's
amazing.
It nails it. It's like there's a thin layer of imaginary dust on everything.
Yeah,
in a good way.
Because I read everything whenever I get PDFs or colors and stuff like that. I always go look at it on my iPad. I don't look at my computer, and the reason why is my iPad is kind of set more to print, right? So I can see a little bit more what it's going to look like when it's actually printed. So it's not as because that's the thing when you're looking at something that's backlit. It's like your pages are backlit, right? So it's like I try to set things. And so I would go and look at that. And there would be times where I'm like, man, how is she doing this? This looks like it's in print. Like, I mean, it looks like this kind of like grimy, gritty kind of thing. I mean, she is easily one of the best colorists we have in comics. And with this, it's always interesting with working with her here, because it's like, she always does her initial pass, and it's always amazing. And then we find the storytelling elements in it, and then we talk stuff out. But she's always like amping everything up, and she always like tones the scene. She really does think about the toning of each scene and how it helps tell the story, So it's like one of the things we established in Duke was that like every time you see the color red, that means like danger, basically. And here there was some elements of that of like, okay, there's red, but there's also blue. There's a lot of blue in this issue, right? So it's like in the first issue, but blue means something else now because of what's going on with Energon. So it's like, really thinking about what these colors actually mean in the story. And that's something I think she really excels at really well. And her and Tom work amazingly well together. Like, he had made the request for her really early on, and I'm like, yeah, I love Joria. Part of me was like, she colors so many books that she can have the time, and it was like, we'll make it work. And it's been really exciting. Like, I'm glad that even with everything that she does, she's able to keep doing G.I. Joe, and that she's having fun with it.
Awesome. I wanted to jump ahead a little bit because we've seen it's for issue number 2. They mentioned a group called the Valkyries. What, if anything, could you tell us about them?
That's these guys right here. They're on my desk right now. There's one right
Place
here.
of honor.
Yeah, I have a few of them. Well, I think
maybe I'm showing myself off as not a G.I. Joe fan here, as this is like a tried and true thing.
Where did I put? No, so the Valkyries are actually. It's funny. So we were talking about, again, like doing something new and different, and so much of G.I. Joe. It's interesting because so much has been done. It's like when you come into any franchise. I always think about that thing in South Park of like Simpsons did it, right? So it's always about like how do you like what is something new with stuff, and we got lucky because Hasbro had created this force called the Valkyries, and they didn't have a lot of backstory. It was only that I don't even know. Basically, if you look them up, that's kind of a spoiler.
Okay.
Wow.
But they were like, I was like, they have such a cool visual. They're such a cool visual. And part is there aren't a lot of women Cobra characters. There aren't, right? Like outside of, obviously there was Baroness, but that was part of it. Oh, the number one Cobra woman we're taking away, right? And so we were introducing Chameleon, and we had all these different elements, but I was like, we need to have more women Cobra characters. And I was like, oh, there's the Valkyries. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. We can do something with them. And then I found out, because of timing, they had never appeared in anything. Nothing. No comics, no games, no movies, nothing. The Valkyries somehow, just by timing, they're a relatively new thing that Hasbro had created. They had never appeared in anything before. And so I was like, oh, you mean that we can do it first? We can have the first like appearance of these characters in the comics? Hell yeah, let's go. Let's go. And so Tom draws the hell out of their introduction. It's really cool. They're brutal. So, but they also have like, they're such a cool visual. Yeah, I have a bunch of them. They're kind of troop builder, you know, but anyway.
Stepping back for a sec, why? So that we had these other G.I. Joe books, and now this is sort of like the flagship G.I. Joe. Why didn't this come first? And what is driving it to have it come now?
I had that same question originally, like when we were first starting out. I'm like, why are we calling it Duke? This is weird, way, you know. Why are we calling it Duke? Why are we just calling it G.I. Joe? And why are we, you know, and then eventually we had the Cobra Commander book. I'm like, why are we just calling this Cobra? And we started having these back and forth. And Robert really nailed it. And it's something I think about a lot lately. Where basically Robert was like, we have to do the unexpected. We can't do the obvious. Like the obvious thing would be Transformers G.I. Joe. And in fact, it would have been, here's Transformers #1. It wouldn't have been introduced in Void Rivals #1. Right? Yeah. Was intended to be a surprise. And I think something that Robert thinks about a lot, and I think about a lot is that I think we need more surprises in comics. I think there's a lot of stuff that feels obvious and goes, oh, well, that makes sense. And it's a little bit like, it should still make sense. But it's like, can there be surprises? Can you have that kind of unexpected fun? I think a lot of us in comics, maybe we're all way too in the know. Maybe we've been doing it for too long. You see the patterns, you see the stuff. It's so rare that you get like, oh, they're doing that? Like, holy crap, I didn't see that coming. And I think that's something with Void Rivals where it was like, you know, nobody knew Void Rivals was going to end with Jetfire, right? So it was like, and then to be like, here's how we're introducing this. We're introducing this way versus the way we could have. And that was why we went that order. It was like, okay, let's do something different. Let's introduce these characters this way and then consolidate it down into the book because that's something different and something unexpected. And so that was really so much of what Energon Universe is about. But also I love that stuff. I think it was all the time. I wish there were more surprises in comics. I love when it's surprises. Not just it's tough because like when you read a book and something happened and you gasp, you know? Mm-hmm. Like it can be so it can be rare. I remember reading like Hickman did Alien Avengers issue 1. Like I gasped when I was reading that book and I'm like, hell yeah, that's what we need. So it's like, yeah, I'm always trying to find places for that.
I still gasp when in the Energon Universe books when I see Transformers and Joes together. Because I'm like, how do you guys know each other? You should know each other. You're different. Well, as a fan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to wonder if we were going to bring in other Hasbro properties. Are we going to see My Little Pony?
Oh, he's got to keep reading. He's got to keep reading. I don't know about My Little Pony.
Gasp.
I don't know where My Little Pony would show up. My daughter used to. It's funny. My daughter used to love My Little Pony. It's funny when you have kids and they suddenly like are not in something anymore.
Yeah. Like, what? I'm into it now.
My son does that like every couple of months and it drives me insane. But I bought you all of these things. What are we doing?
Yes, that happens all the time. I was actually talking to my wife about this last night. I was going through like a wish list and it had all these things my daughter was into 2 years ago. And I was just like, delete. She doesn't care about any of this now. But yeah, there'll definitely be, some connective tissue between Transformers and G.I. Joe. And you'll see there's a little bit in the first issue because that actually references something that happens happened in Transformers. And so there will definitely be some connective tissue and you'll see it as we go. It's we're not trying to rush everything. But again, that's part of the trick is that like we're really trying to make it so things are unexpected. So we hope that, people are surprised as they're reading it.
We're going to have to let you go in a second, so I wanted to ask you real quick before we do, are we going to get any PSAs in the book at the end?
Oh, dude, I was just looking at those yesterday. I don't know yet. I wish we had time for one in issue 1. I think we will probably eventually get to that. It's funny, I was looking at the PSAs last night. I think we're gonna try something with those, but I'm not sure when.
All right. Sure. Well, it sounds like you don't know, and don't knowing is the other half of the battle, I guess.
Yeah, right. I mean, with some of this, that's actually we usually plan a lot of stuff out, but when it comes to little things like that, I'm always like, I know we talk about stuff, but I don't always know when. If you ask what happens in issue 50, I can tell you, but I can't tell you what the PSA is.
Right. Well, it's a short little thing. It could pop up anywhere, like the end of an arc, just like the end of an episode.
Yeah.
Little walk away moral with what we have.
That's smart. Yeah. All right.
And if you'd like to support this podcast and all the podcasts we do, patreon.com/Comic Book Club. Also, we do a live show every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. to Facebook and YouTube. Come hang out. We would love to chat with you about G.I. Joe. I bet Pete would in particular.
Apple, Spotify. He's going to be so jealous.
Apple, Spotify, Android, or the app of your choice to subscribe, listen, and follow the show at Comic Book Live on Twitter/X, Comic Book Club Live on TikTok and Instagram, comicbookclublive.com. For this podcast and many more. Until next time, we'll see you where knowing is half the battle.
Nice. Really landed it. Cyclops and Duke are the same person.
Big man.